Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take that stack of sources you've shared with us and we really try to cut through the noise, find those essential bits of knowledge.
Get to the core of it.
Exactly. And today, wow, we've got quite a mix. There's the sudden suspension of Jimmy Kimmel's show, which is causing waves.
We'll talk about that one.
Yeah. Then there are these really controversial development plans being floated for Gaza.
Deeply sensitive.
And we've also got a former CDC director's pretty startling testimony about, well, health policy integrity.
Which has huge implications.
And finally, something completely different, a discovery that might just rewrite a big chunk of ancient history.
Fascinating stuff.
So our mission, as always, is to unpack these, connect the dots where we can, and help you figure out what's really important here.
Right. We're looking at politics, media, public health, even archaeology today. And each story gives us a different lens on things, how information gets controlled, how power operates, both here and abroad, and how our whole understanding of the past can shift.
Okay, let's dive right in then with that big media story. The indefinite suspension of Jimmy Kimmel Live by ABC. That felt pretty sudden to a lot of people.
Came out of the blue for many, yeah.
So what kicked it off? Looking at the sources, it seems to pinpoint his September 15th monologue. He went after what he called the Magsy gang.
Right.
Accused them of trying to spin the narrative around Charlie Kirk's killer, Tyler Robinson, saying they wanted to portray him as anything other than one of them and were, quote, capitalizing on the murder.
Strong words.
Very. Then he played a clip of President Trump talking about construction at the White House.
Okay.
And Kimmel quipped that Trump was at the fourth stage of grief construction, mourning Kirk, like a 4-year-old mourns a goldfish.
Oof. Pretty biting.
Yeah, and he didn't stop there. He also brought up what he saw as Republican hypocrisy, mentioning VP J.D. Vance talking about lunatics and then reminding people about the Capitol rioters wanting to hang Mike Pence.
Yep.
So that was the monologue. What happened next that led to the show getting pulled?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and fast. The escalation was incredibly quick. You have the Federal Communications Commission Chair, Brendan Carr. He's a Trump appointee, almost immediately signaling, let's say, strong disapproval.
Okay.
And it wasn't just disapproval. He publicly threatened to take action against Disney and ABC. He even mentioned possibly revoking affiliate licenses. His exact words were apparently, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way."
Well, that's pretty direct.
Extremely direct. And the timing, you see, is critical. Disney is right in the middle of seeking regulatory approval for ESPN to acquire the NFL network. A huge deal.
Right. Billions of dollars on the line.
Exactly. And it wasn't just Carr or Disney. Nexstar Media Group, they own something like 200 ABC affiliates. They preempted Kimmel's show right away. And guess what? They're also waiting for FCC approval for their own massive $6.2 billion acquisition of Tegna.
So multiple major players with deals pending before the FCC.
Precisely. Sinclair, another big affiliate owner, also pulled the show. So if you connect those dots, it paints a picture, doesn't it? It strongly suggests how regulatory leverage, especially during these sensitive M&A periods, can be, well, a powerful tool to influence content decisions. Maybe not direct censorship, but
A chilling effect, perhaps.
that's the term many are using, yeah. A definite chilling effect.
And President Trump, predictably, weighed in quickly on Truth Social, celebrated the suspension, called it great news for America. He also took shots at Kimmel, saying zero talent, bad ratings, and even called for NBC to cancel Fallon and Myers, too.
Right, the ratings argument.
Yeah, but let's unpack that. The bad ratings claim, how much water does that hold? What do the actual numbers say?
That's a really important question because it gets to the motivation, right? While Trump pushed the bad ratings line, the data we have from latenighter.com, it tells a slightly different story, especially when you looked at the demographic advertisers care most about.
The 18 to 49 group.
Exactly. In that key demo, Kimmel was actually leading the big three broadcast shows in his time slot, 11:35 p.m. He averaged about 220,000 viewers there.
Okay, leading. Who is he ahead of?
Just slightly ahead of Stephen Colbert, who had 219,000, and well ahead of Jimmy Fallon at 157,000.
So in the demo that pays the bills, he was number one.
Pretty much, yeah. Now, if you look at total viewers for the second quarter of 2025, Colbert was definitely ahead there with about 2.42 million. Kimmel had 1.77 million and Fallon 1.19 million.
Okay, so second in total viewers, But first, in the key demo.
Correct. So the narrative of just plain bad ratings causing this, it doesn't quite square with the data, especially the demographic data that matters most for ad revenue. It kind of lends weight to the idea that maybe the regulatory threats carried more punch.
That makes sense. It sounds like the ratings might have been, well, a convenient excuse, or at least not the whole story, and the reaction, as you'd expect, has been really split.
Deeply divided.
On one side, you've got people like Sean Hannity basically cheering, saying Kimmel simply failed at his job. But on the other, you have the Writers Guild calling it state censorship and corporate cowardice. The American Federation of Musicians put out a statement saying, basically, look, this is not complicated. Trump's FCC identified speech it did not like and threatened ABC. This is state censorship.
Strong statements.
Very. Celebrities like Wanda Sykes, Mark Maron, they echoed that. And even former President Obama weighed in. He said this administration has taken it to a new and dangerous level by routinely threatening regulatory action, and that this is exactly what the First Amendment was designed to prevent.
Adding significant weight there.
Yeah, and Fiona O'Brien from Reporters Without Borders called it a really dangerous moment for democracy, even comparing the tactics to authoritarian regimes. So, stepping back from all the noise, what's the core takeaway here?
I think the key insight really is multifaceted. It's bigger than just Kimmel or one monologue. It's a stark example of how regulatory threats, especially when they're hanging over these massive corporate deals, can act as a really powerful, almost invisible form of content control.
Invisible because it's not direct censorship law, but pressure.
Exactly. The FCC's power to greenlight or block billions in deals gives them immense leverage. So this whole situation really highlights how political pressure, directly or indirectly, can create that chilling effect on speech across the media. It raises serious questions about, the independence of news and entertainment media and where the line is between legitimate oversight and government coercion.
Okay, a complex interplay of media, politics, and corporate interests. Let's shift gears now to an equally complex and sensitive area, geopolitics and the future of Gaza. There were some really striking comments from Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich recently.
Yes, those definitely caught attention.
He was speaking at a real estate conference, of all places, and talked about serious discussions happening to rebuild Gaza as a, quote, business enterprise with American help. He even mentioned a real business plan on President Trump's table and talked about turning the situation into a real estate bonanza.
Real estate bonanza. The choice of words is, well, it's notable, especially given the context.
Extremely notable. What is that context?
Well, these comments are coming right in the middle of Israel's intense ground offensive in Gaza City, an offensive that is causing, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to flee their homes. It's a massive humanitarian crisis unfolding.
Right.
And Smotrich's vision, this real estate bonanza, it also kind of echoes comments President Trump made earlier this year where he floated the idea of a U.S. takeover of Gaza to turn it into, I think the phrase was, a Riviera of the Middle East.
But setting aside the optics or the sensitivity, what about the legality? Can you just plan a real estate bonanza on land where people have been displaced?
That's the absolutely crucial question. And the answer from international law experts is pretty unequivocal. No. Any plans to take over land or property left behind by displaced Palestinians would be a clear violation of international law.
Which laws specifically?
Primarily the Fourth Geneva Convention. It governs the protection of civilians in wartime and specifically prohibits an occupying power from making permanent changes to occupied territory unless it's for the security of the occupation or for the benefit of the local population. It also forbids the appropriation of property.
So developing it as a bonanza for external investors wouldn't qualify?
Not even close.
Yeah.
Especially when the original inhabitants have been forcibly displaced.
It feels incredibly jarring, that phrase real estate bonanza, when you think about hundreds of thousands potentially losing their homes permanently. What are the sort of deeper implications of floating ideas like this?
Well, the key insight here, I think, is that these kinds of business plans, they don't just brush up against international law. They seem to steamroll right over it. They reveal this really profound and, frankly, ethically troubling disconnect between certain geopolitical or economic ambitions and the immediate dire humanitarian reality on the ground.
A disconnect.
Yeah. Proposing this kind of redevelopment fundamentally undermines the rights of the displaced population. Well, it could set a really dangerous precedent globally, suggesting that, land emptied by conflict is just up for grabs for redevelopment. Regardless of the rights and claims of the people forced to leave, it prioritizes potential profit over people and law. And that inherently challenges the core principles of humanitarian law and probably makes any future peace efforts vastly more difficult.
Right, because it denies the claims of the people who are actually living there.
Precisely. We're talking about the homes of hundreds of thousands of people.
Okay, so from international law complexities, let's pivot back home to a critical domestic issue: public health policy and the integrity of the institutions involved. We saw former CDC Director Susan Manarez testify recently before a Senate committee,
Yes, the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions.
and she described some tense meetings she had with the current health secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. What did she say happened?
Her testimony was quite detailed. She specifically recounted getting into an exchange, as she put it, with Secretary Kennedy. This happened after she said she was willing to consider changes to the childhood vaccine schedule, but only if there was solid scientific evidence to support those changes.
Okay, standard scientific practice.
Exactly. But then, crucially, she stated that she refused demands from the health secretary to sign off on certain recommendations because she hadn't been presented with any data to back them up.
She refused to sign off without seeing data.
Correct. And this testimony is particularly timely because it came just before today's meeting of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP.
Right, ACIP, what's happening there?
Well, there are 12 new members on that committee, all appointed by Secretary Kennedy. And they're expected to review and vote on recommendations for vaccines against measles, COVID, and hepatitis B.
So Manarez basically stood her ground, insisting on data. For people who aren't familiar, maybe explain briefly, what is the normal process for changing vaccine schedules, and why is this tension between Manarez and Kennedy and this ACIP meeting raising concerns?
Sure, the established way vaccine schedules are updated is, well, it's meant to be a really rigorous, science-driven process. It involves looking at loads of clinical trial results, epidemiological data, how diseases are spreading, and critically, recommendations from independent expert groups like ACIP.
Independent being the key word.
Absolutely. ACIP's whole purpose is to provide objective scientific advice to the CDC director on how vaccines should be used. This independence is fundamental for public trust.
Okay.
So when you have a situation where a health secretary, who's a political appointee, is reportedly pushing for changes or trying to get sign-offs without that supporting data, well, it naturally raises questions about the integrity of that whole process.
And the concern about the new ACIP members.
The worry for some in the public health community is that appointing a large block of new members, all selected by this particular secretary, could potentially shift the committee's focus away from purely evidence-based decisions towards perhaps a more politically influenced agenda.
I see.
So the core insight here, really, is this potential clash between political influence and the bedrock principles of evidence-based public health. When that scientific integrity seems threatened, even perception-wise, it can seriously damage public trust in vaccines, trust in institutions like the CDC, and that has really significant, long-lasting consequences for everyone's health. It undermines our ability to fight infectious diseases effectively.
Yeah, that erosion of trust is such a critical point. Okay, let's shift gears one last time to something completely different, but honestly pretty mind-bending. It challenges what most of us think we know about ancient history. When I say mummy, what comes to mind?
Egypt, almost certainly.
Yeah.
Elaborate tombs, bandages.
Right. Or maybe, if you know a bit more, those amazing natural mummies from South America, like the Chinchorro mummies in Chile.
Yeah, some of the oldest ones known. Until now, perhaps.
Exactly. Because here's where it gets wild. Scientists are now reporting finds they're calling the world's oldest specimens, but they're on the other side of the planet.
Okay, intriguing. Where?
Archaeological sites in southern China and Southeast Asia.
Wow. Not the usual suspects for mummification at all. How old are we talking?
This is the staggering part. The burials date back between 4,000 and, wait for it, 14,000 years?
14,000. That's
What?
incredible. That pushes the timeline way back.
Way back. And these are remains from hunter-gatherer communities. They were found buried in these tightly crouched or squatting positions, and the analysis suggests they were actually smoke-dried over a fire before burial.
Smoke dried. So that implies intentional preservation,
Right.
not just accidental.
Exactly. It looks like a deliberate process of mummification, just using a different technique than the Egyptians or the natural processes in South America.
14,000 years ago. Hunter-gatherers. Smoke drying bodies.
Yeah.
That's amazing. What does this tell us about those early people? How does this sort of smoke drying compare to the Egyptian methods?
Well, that comparison is really key to the insight here. Egyptian mummification, as we know, was incredibly complex chemicals, removing organs, elaborate ritual.
Right, a whole industry almost.
Yeah. This method, smoke drying, is obviously much simpler technologically, but it was still effective, and it shows its incredible ingenuity and likely a deep-seated desire to preserve the dead long before things like agriculture, cities, or complex state societies emerged.
So it suggests these complex spiritual beliefs or funerary practices might be much older and more widespread than we thought.
Precisely. It makes us really rethink the sophistication of these very early human communities. The desire to preserve the dead, maybe for beliefs about an afterlife or honoring ancestors, wasn't just confined to a few later advanced civilizations.
So the big takeaway,
The key insight is that this discovery fundamentally shatters that traditional link we make between mummification and just Egypt or South America. It pushes the timeline back by millennia and massively expands the map of where and when this practice occurred. It suggests that complex cultural and spiritual behaviors, including intentionally preserving bodies, emerged much earlier and in diverse hunter-gatherer groups across the globe, way before we previously imagined. It really forces us to reconsider the whole timeline of human cultural evolution.
wow, a genuine rewriting of the history books, potentially.
It really seems like it. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive today, from the pressures on media in the U.S.,
To those deeply concerning development plans for Gaza,
the critical debates around public health integrity,
and ending with this potential revolution in understanding ancient human history.
quite the range.
And each story, in its own way, touches on how information gets framed, how power is used, and how our actual understanding of reality, whether it's current events or the distant past, is constantly being shaped and, frankly, contested.
Yeah, we saw political pressure impacting media, international law versus development goals, science versus politics and health, and new discoveries just upending old historical certainties.
Exactly.
So, as we wrap up, here's something maybe for you, the listener, to think about. In this world overflowing with headlines, with narratives constantly clashing, how do you navigate it all? What tools or approaches do you use to weigh the information you receive to try and discern what's credible, especially when really fundamental principles like free speech or international law or scientific integrity seem to be under pressure or are being actively reshaped?
A crucial question for all of us right now.
Definitely something to mull over. That's all for this deep dive.